My name's Annie and I'm a Visitor Engagement Assistant here at the library. Welcome to our Being Human Festival event, Let's Talk About Food. Today we're going to be meeting Dr Rachel Winchcombe, a historian from the University of Leeds, and Professor Amanda Bamford, a plant scientist from the University of Manchester. Come on, let's go and find them. "2020 marks 400 years since the first settler colonists arrived in the Americas on the Mayflower. Which foods would they have eaten once they arrived in the Americas, and how would that have been different from what they were used to?"
Yeah, so when they arrive in the New World, they're confronted by a radically different environment. They're confronted by lots of new foods, new plants, new commodities, and they were a bit anxious and ambiguous about what these foods would do to their bodies. And that's because in this period, so in the 16th and 17th centuries, diet was seen as really crucial, not just in terms of health, but also in terms of your personality, even your appearance and your national identity. So the food you ate literally made you who you were. Okay, so if we're thinking of someone like an English man, okay, he would have considered the foods that he ate integral to his position as an Englishman. Okay, so things like wheat bread, beer, beef, these are the things that made him English. So you can imagine then, if we're travelling to the New World, these men, these women, these children, and they were forced to eat foods that they were not used to eating, then they would worry about whether or not they would retain that Englishness. And in fact, we have lots of accounts of people worrying about if they ate things like maize, tomatoes, potatoes, so foods that were indigenous to the Americas, whether that would make their bodies more like indigenous bodies. And that was a real fear for people.
So that's very different to what it is nowadays. We have fears and anxieties around food, but not about that it would actually change us and who we are.
Yeah, exactly. So they had the same concerns about health and nutrition that we have today, but they also had this additional level of fear because it was very much part of their identity, and it was a way of demarcating between people as well. So what made, in an English mind, them superior is partly the food that they ate, because that cultivated a particular kind of body that was believed to be superior. So yeah, very quite different, but those same kinds of anxieties I think we can appreciate today. Now that's not to say that they didn't try new foods and enjoy them, because they obviously did. We wouldn't still be eating these things today if people hadn't enjoyed them, 400 years ago. So the things that they talk about that they're quite positive about, things like turkeys, so that's another thing that comes from the Americas originally. Things like tobacco, they're very positive about. Other foods like pineapples, avocados.
Pineapples, pineapples.
Yeah, so still things that we enjoy now.
That.
Yeah. And they're really positive about these things. I think one reason that some foods are greeted with a lot more positivity is that they're kind of a supplement to a diet. So an avocado is not something that's going to make up a significant proportion of your diet, whereas something like maize, which is a staple food for indigenous peoples, that would have been considered something sort of crucial to your diet. So they're less keen on those things that might replace the key parts of an English diet, but they're quite keen to try things as supplements to their diets rather than as something that is going to replace English foods.
So it's not like we have this idea now about food and our culture and how the link between that. They linked it to actually their physical bodies of what they were eating.
Yeah, and it is linked to culture as well. So if we take something like beef, Mediterranean writers, so Mediterranean physicians, are really critical of beef. They think it's only for they call them rustics, so labourers, people that are outside a lot, people with not very delicate constitutions. They're the people that can eat beef. But then they say the reason that the English can eat beef is because they've done it for centuries. So there is a cultural link, but the culture also then shapes the body. It changes the body.
So that's a very different concept of what we have. I think
Yeah.
most people find that a very difficult concept.
Yeah, so the belief is that your body is something that is open to the forces around you, whether that be the climate you live in, the air you breathe, or of course the food that you eat. And it has the power to literally change how your body works inside. And I think that's the difference, this idea that what's happening inside your body has a significant impact on your identity and your personality and your appearance, and what is happening inside your body can be impacted by what you put into it.
So the early settlers must have been really challenged by all these new foods that they're seeing and coming into contact with.
Yeah, definitely. So someone like John Gerard, so this is this book that we have here, he's an early modern botanist, so he's writing this, he first writes this at the end of the 16th century. He talks about things like maize and how bad it is for an English constitution. He says it's only fit to be consumed by swine. And that the reason the indigenous peoples of America eat it is because they don't know any better. So there's this belief that the food can actually make you superior. It makes your body different to that of other people.
But they obviously did eat the new
Yeah, I mean,
foods.
they kind of had to out of necessity.
You've got a picture here of, the potato, and so they obviously liked the potato.
Yeah, eventually. A lot of these foods take a long time to naturalise into European diets. And if we're thinking about the colonists in particular, they're going to be eating these foods much more regularly than people back in Europe. So for much of the 16th century, these are kind of curiosities that people are interested in. They might try them, but it's not fundamentally altering their diets until a little bit later. Whereas for the colonists, it really would have been, because they tried to grow wheat, they weren't very successful at that. It was very, very expensive to transport cattle to the New World, so they couldn't eat beef. So they were kind of forced to try these new foods. And when they try these new foods, it doesn't change their bodies significantly. It doesn't diminish their Englishness. It doesn't make them sick. So this is perhaps where you get sort of a change in interpretation or a change in understanding of the role food has on your body as well.
But a lot of these early foods don't really look like the foods that we know and love at the moment. So the potato, what they were eating, is very different to the potato we're eating now. The maize that they ate is very different to the maize that we're eating now, because of all the highly bred breeding that's going on since that time, to make them more palatable very often to us.
Yeah, and I think that's something that historians have to think about, is that when we read these descriptions, where someone like John Gerard might talk about how disgusting a tomato is, like he says that it doesn't taste very nice. Now, is that him being negative about it because it's a New World plant, or would it have tasted significantly different? And we're assuming that these plants that we still have today are similar to these ones that we had in the past, and we know that that's not the case necessarily.
Yeah. Well, we've got some early maize that, because you mentioned maize a lot in your writings, and it was very important to the Indigenous community. And I've brought along some maize from Manchester Museum that was originally found in the ancient tombs in Peru, and it looks very, very different to the maize that you see growing in the fields around us at the moment. Really small in size. It was very difficult to process and difficult to grow, and we've really bred it now. It's going through lots of iterations and lots of breeding over the centuries to produce the corn that we have in our supermarkets now. It's much sweeter, and it's much easier to farm. They've even bred it so that the corn cobs, they can come off more easily, the right height, so it can be harvested very easily with mechanical means. So the maize that we eat now, it's very, very little recognisable from what the Indigenous communities were eating.
And that's interesting, actually, what you said about processing and how it would be more difficult to process these older varieties of maize, because that's something that the texts on the New World talk a lot about, how Indigenous peoples prepare maize. And I hadn't really thought that was partly because the maize that they were growing is significantly different to how we experience that today.
Yeah, we've bred it so it has much softer kernels, and they release much easier. So that's all breeding by agriculture, so that we can use it much more easily. We don't have to process it so much.
I think that's really interesting for us to think about as well, and I guess it's something that historians don't tend to think about, is, we think of food or vegetables as being somehow inherently natural, that, you pick them and it's just the environment that's grown it in that way, but there's all this science and this knowledge behind it to make it the kind of product that is palatable to us in the modern world.
So do you have any other examples of foods that would have changed significantly over the last 400 years since those colonists arrived in the Americas?
Yeah, I mean, some of these foods were changing at the time, so in the early modern period, in the 17th and 18th centuries. And a good example of that is strawberries. I'll just move that out of the way. Here's one we prepared earlier. Pull that back a bit. Yeah, so strawberries are a really good example of how Europeans in this period are engaging with new plants from the New World and thinking about how they might improve them for European palates. So I think here we've got, is it a Virginia strawberry?
That's right, yeah, from 1877 from the herbarium collection at Manchester Museum.
Okay, so the Virginia strawberry is an interesting one. This is something that early English colonists encounter numerous times, and they write about it a lot in their travel narratives. And they really love them. So they say that they're sweeter, they're bigger, they're juicier than the wild strawberries that they're used to getting back in England. And actually, they bring plants back to England to try and grow themselves, but it's notoriously difficult to grow in England, this particular strawberry, and they don't have much success with it. And then later, we get crossbreedings of strawberries, and that kind of leads us to the strawberries that we're used to having today.
Like the story with the maize.
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
yeah.
It's the same thing. So they're taking these different varieties. So I think they cross a Virginia strawberry with a Chilean strawberry, and that's kind of where our modern domesticated strawberry comes from. And they're doing that because they want to grow bigger fruits. They want them to be sweeter, tastier. So this is something that's not just sort of a modern day phenomenon. You know, this kind of crossbreeding is happening in this period as well.
Well, this specimen is from Vermont. It's got Maize 1877. And when Rachel Webster, the curator at the museum, sent this to me, I was really surprised because I didn't think it was going to be so recognisable as a strawberry. As a botanist, I can still, identify that as a strawberry. And, and that's what I was worried about when I was coming to meet you, and you were going to be talking about all the foods that you've read about. How do we know that when they call it a strawberry, it's the same plant that we would call by its Latin name a strawberry? Yeah. But looking at this, it's very same as what we see in present day.
So I guess there's levels, isn't there, of crossbreeding? I guess some changes can be relatively minor, relatively small.
It still looks small compared to the strawberries you buy from your garden centre now.
Yeah,
I mean, the leaves are still small.
Even when I go to the supermarket now and you see, Scottish strawberry against, I think, where else do they come from? Spain? They tend to be massive, those Spanish strawberries, compared to the sort of deep red Scottish ones. So I guess even now there's so many varieties that it is really difficult to know. When I'm reading this description of somebody eating a strawberry, are they having a similar experience to when I eat a strawberry?
Because obviously they don't use the Latin name as the scientific name. So, that's going to be the difficulty, I can imagine, when you're reading these botany books.
Yeah.
So how do you see the foods we eat changing over the next 400 years or even 50 years?
Well, I think climate change is definitely going to have a big impact on what we eat, where we grow it, its quality. So, there's been big changes in the last 400 years that you study, but me as interested in how climate is going to affect agriculture moving forward, and the studies have shown that places where we grow some of our staple crops like rice, maize, wheat, some of those areas are not going to be able to sustain the yields that they are now because of the change in temperature, change in rainfall. Some places are going to get drier, some places are going to get wetter. So farmers are going to have to adapt to new agricultural practices. And some of them might even have to grow a different crop than they had done in the past. So there's going to be big changes going forward with climate change.
I think that's really interesting as well, because it does still have some parallels with the period that I study. So the period where English colonists were first settling in North America, so really the early 17th century, it's known as a period, it's called the Little Ice Age. So this is a period of global cooling. And it's a phenomenon that happens across the globe in this period. And this is something that the colonists had to deal with. So when they arrived in Virginia in 1607 originally, they were met with really harsh winters, really cold and really dry, which meant that even plants that did relatively well in those climates, so things like maize, became even more difficult to grow. And colonists, in fact, had to source a lot of their food from the indigenous population because they just did not know how to farm with these new climatic conditions in place. So they couldn't grow the wheat that they hoped to. They couldn't even grow the maize to keep them going. So it's really interesting that these changes to climate
take place. There's parallels here all the time, aren't there? We're picking up.
Yeah, definitely.
It's talking to each other. It's fascinating. And you know, there's the crops that we're used to eating. The staple crops are really highly bred, and we've talked about maize and strawberries. So they're highly bred, and that means they're very sensitive to soil conditions, environmental conditions, because we've bred them for high yields. We've sort of ignored the resilient crops of the past and tried to breed these high-yielding crops, which means they've lost a lot of that tolerance to differences in temperature. You know, they're very, I think, sensitive souls. They want lots of fertiliser, they want a lot of looking after. But in climate change moving forward over the next 50, 100, 150 years, those crops are not going to be able to survive in the conditions that they like. So there's a thing called climate smart agriculture, which is all about changing the way we practice agriculture, the crops we grow, and maybe looking back to ancestor crops and breeding back in the traits that enabled them to survive in the very sort of primitive ways that they were grown in the past, without the high-tech equipment and fertilisers and pesticides. So we're going to have to look back. A lot of people are really interested in looking back to these early ancestors and early varieties of crops and look and see if we can take them to improve our present crops and making them more tolerant moving forward so we can maintain our crop production. Because it's a really big concern worldwide. Maybe we're going to end up eating, instead of having maize and wheat, we're going to have to look for things like sorghum. Sorghum is a staple crop grown in Africa, and millet, because they're crops that can survive arid environments, hot temperatures. So we're going to have to look for alternative foods, just like your early settlers 400 years ago had to do.
And I guess we're going to also have to adjust our palates for those new foods, like the colonists did. And we might have the same kind of initial anxieties about eating these different foods or initial revulsions for eating. But I think I read somewhere about how in the future a really important source of protein is going to be insects. And I guess that is the same thing for us here in England, in Europe. There's a kind of a strange sort of taboo around eating those kind of foods, in the same way that English settlers might have worried about eating maize. So do you think that's something that we're going to have to sort of overcome in the future, our specific cultures of food and what it tells us is a good food to eat and what is a bad food to eat?
I think there's a lot, you mentioned anxiety, and I think at the moment there's still a lot of anxiety with people now. I mean, food is one of the biggest anxieties that people have. You know, is it healthy? Is it organic? Is it good for me? You know, veganism, animal welfare.
Affordability, can I afford these foods?
Yeah, so food, there's a lot of anxiety at present around about food. Where does it come from? Carbon, miles, how sustainability, because I'm the head of university sustainability, academic lead for sustainability. So I'm very aware of, carbon and its food miles and what food contribution that has to that problem. So I think the anxiety your early settlers have, I don't think it's gone away. It's just maybe morphed into not necessarily the physical aspect you're talking about. And don't you think a lot of people now have a disconnect with where their food's coming from? At least your settlers, they saw it being grown. I think you have a map where the early settlers mapped out their farm. So maybe you could show us that?
Yeah. So here we have a book that was produced in 1590. It's an absolutely beautiful book, so one of the treasures of the John Rylands collection, I think. And it shows us that people were fascinated by the Indigenous environment in this period, and they were keen to observe it and show that to their readers back in Europe. So here we have an image of Virginia in the late 16th century, and it's filled with Indigenous crops. So we see the fields of maize. We see nice little details here, so I don't know if you can see this, but there's a big sunflower growing there. We have a field of pumpkins as well. So these are really important plants to Indigenous diets. These are things that people would have been eating on a daily basis. And what you can see here is the maize that's just been planted, and then it's ripening in the different fields.
I like the way it's all in straight lines.
Yeah,
Straight lines.
I would say that this is a very idealised, Europeanised vision of how agriculture should happen. And this is actually not how Indigenous farmers would have grown maize. So they really recognise the value of mixed cropping. So they mixed their maize seeds with pumpkins, with squash, with beans, even with sunflowers, because they realised that their crops would grow better because they would help replenish the soil and keep the fields growing for different seasons. Now, this isn't something that this particular image alludes to, but in texts written by English colonists, they do witness Indigenous farmers practising mixed cropping. So they knew it was a practice that was used. I don't think they really understood why it was a useful technique, and they don't necessarily take that on for themselves. So they waste a lot of land in North America by planting wheat, wait until the soil is exhausted and then moving on to a new plot of land. So they really change the American environment and how it functions by introducing these more traditional European agricultural methods.
That weren't particularly suited necessarily for the soil that they were growing in.
Exactly.
I mean,
the
it's the
crops,
thing with
yeah.
mixed cropping as well. I mean, it does make it difficult to harvest. You know, you have to harvest very often by hand, which I assume they were doing anyway. But you know, nowadays there's much more interest in mixed cropping. There's agroforestry where you're mixing trees with a crop as well, and the trees will provide shelter. And if you use a legume tree, that will provide nitrogen to your soil, just like the beans and the peas provide nitrogen to the soil. So, you know, the new techniques going forward with climate crisis and climate change, agriculture is looking to be a bit more innovative, I can never say that word, and not necessarily, you know, the straight lines, huge crops of wheat and nothing else.
It's really interesting that it's kind of almost, it's like what you were saying about looking back into the past for different varieties. We're also looking kind of into the past for these different methods of agriculture as well, thinking about how certain crops were farmed in the past and maybe how we can sort of replicate that on a bigger scale.
But the big proviso is the yield. I mean, they weren't trying to feed 7 billion people, no. Up to 9 billion people. So there's some of these techniques you say, yeah, that would work, you know, but it's not going to work on the scale and the population we're feeding now. They didn't get the yields that we feel we get now. So that's the conundrum, is getting the yields, but also having this climate smart agriculture together. So you have the traits, but you also keep the yield. And some of these techniques they use maybe have not given the big yield that we need now. But you know, you can always learn from the past and help to frame the future. That's what I believe.
Definitely.
So what role did food play in the relationship between the European settler colonists and with Indigenous peoples in the Americas? Okay,
so I would say that food is sort of critical to Anglo-Indigenous relations throughout colonial history. And we can kind of see that in some of the images in this book as well. So I'm just going to very carefully turn the page here. Remember, this is over 400 years old, so we have to be very careful with how we're turning these pages. So here we have another really interesting image, and it shows two Indigenous Algonquians sitting down to eat. And the engraver, Theodore de Brie, who's working from Frankfurt, he's foregrounding these new Indigenous ingredients that the English are interested in. So again, we've got the maize in the corner here. So they're kind of, on the one hand, very fascinated by Indigenous eating. And actually in this caption, so this is in Latin, but the English translation is very positive about Indigenous people's dietary practices, especially moderation. So they're known as very moderate eaters. They don't overeat, which is a vice that is very prominent in England in this period. So there's lots of texts written in 16th and 17th century England about the gluttony of the English and how it's such a terrible vice that they need to get over. So they're looking at how these Indigenous peoples are eating, and they're thinking, actually, we could learn a thing or two here. We could be more moderate eaters. It will make us healthier, and it will also make us more sort of morally upright as well. So as well as being sort of interested in what Indigenous peoples were eating, they also were really reliant on these populations, especially in the early decades of colonisation. So like I said before, they're confronted with this new environment. They don't know how to farm this land. Half the time they haven't even brought any equipment with them to do it. It tends to be gentlemen that are on these first voyages, so they sort of turn up in the New World with absolutely no
Did
idea.
any plants or any that sort of thing, seeds or anything with them?
Some of them did. So Thomas Harriot, who wrote this book, he tells us how he does a trial of wheat when he goes there. So he does a little scientific experiment to see if he can grow wheat. But the problem is, these people who are investing in these projects are reading these kinds of texts and thinking, oh, this is an abundant environment. It's really easy to grow all these crops. We don't need to bring anything with us. It will be absolutely fine. And then they realise when they get there that they haven't got the equipment, they haven't got the knowledge, and they're completely reliant on these indigenous populations to feed them.
Do you know what's in the dish in the middle?
I'm not sure, to be honest. It doesn't say. Now,
it looks like beans or peas or beans.
The thing we've got to remember as well is that the person who's creating these engravings, Theodore de Bruyne, has never been to the Americas. So these are actually based on a set of watercolours that were created by John White, who was the first governor of the Roanoke colony in the late 16th centuries. And so part of this is tricky to say that this is an accurate representation of Indigenous life. In fact, it's not. We know that it's been Europeanised. We know that Theodore de Bruyne has focused on particular elements for particular reasons. So it's important that when we're looking at these images that we're not thinking about them as accurate reflections of what's going on, but more of an insight into how colonists were viewing these new lands. Whether
it reflects more on the Europeans than it does on the Indigenous.
100%, and that's something that we always need to remember when we're looking at these images. So yeah, they were completely reliant on the Indigenous population for food, and at certain times this works well. Okay, it creates good relationships because they can exchange with the Indigenous population food for other things that the Indigenous community is interested in getting. So we know, for example, that elite members of Algonquian groups are interested in getting guns from the English so that they can consolidate their power in the region, and that's something that they might exchange for food. Now, where this becomes problematic is in periods of dearth. So I mentioned before the Little Ice Age, so periods where harvests are failing, where the Indigenous population no longer have this surplus of maize to share or to exchange for other things with the English. And at those times we see moments of violence and aggression erupt. So we see English colonists stealing maize from the Indigenous population. We see people dying of starvation. Okay, in 1608 to 1609, this is a period that's known as the starving time. Hundreds of settlers die of starvation. They resort to eating their leather shoes, and there's reports of cannibalism even from the colonies. So I would argue that food and the provision of food is fundamental to colonisation. Not just whether or not it's successful, but how colonists engage with Indigenous populations and how successful those relationships are moving forward. Food is often at the heart of those conflicts.
It's interesting to hear, your research has led to this, because I mean, people in the media hear about, the Indigenous communities helping and being generous. And the settlers wouldn't have survived without them, and that's usually the whole framing of the story. You don't hear anything else that might have gone on at other times.
Yeah, so we kind of, it's that myth of Thanksgiving, isn't it? This idea that the Indigenous peoples are somehow sort of passive and happy to help, happy helpers of colonisation. And they're not. They see this as a strategic exchange. So they're not just giving these people maize because they're kind-hearted. They're doing it as an act of dominance, as a way of asserting their authority in that region. Think of how embarrassing it must have been for these gentlemen who went to the New World and they couldn't feed themselves. And they were relying on these people that they thought were inferior in lots of ways to provide them with this food. So this is a way of Indigenous elites projecting their power and authority.
Yeah. The food's given them the power.
Exactly. If you control those provisions, you control the region. So I think, that's the story that kind of gets a little bit lost in this rose-tinted vision of early colonisation.
So it seems like you've been talking a lot about how crucial food was for these relationships between the settler colonists on one hand and Indigenous peoples on the other hand. I wondered if you could just say a bit more about the emotional impact of food.
I would argue that food in the early modern period, so the 16th, 17th centuries, is really emotionally powerful. So like you say, it helps people form relationships with each other, but as I was talking about earlier, it's also seen as so fundamental to who you are as a person. And that can be quite, it can give people anxiety if they're not eating the right foods. Food can give people joy. It can literally be seen as something that helps create happiness or misery. So if you eat certain foods, that's going to affect your emotional state. So if you eat foods that are delicious, that are tasty, then that's going to be projected in your emotions. So it's really emotionally powerful in this period, not just because of its connection to social relationships and to culture, but also because it's fundamental to how people's bodies work, and it's fundamental to how they see themselves.
So they saw food as not just nutritional, it had an emotional feeding as well as nutritional.
Yeah, definitely, and I think in a colonial context, that's even more heightened because food is scarce, it's difficult to get your hands on, and in that context, it gives it even more emotional power.
Did you say that some foods are thought to have heat? I think you mentioned something like that. Can you explain that a bit more to me? Because that's quite a strange concept.
Yeah, so this is quite a complicated framework of understanding. So people thought in this period that their body was made up of 4 liquids that were called humours. So these were blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile. And each of these humours had specific elemental qualities. So they could be hot and dry, or cold and wet, or cold and dry. And foods had the same elemental qualities.
Right.
So something like an onion was considered hot and dry. So if you ate that, that would increase your yellow column, which is the hot, dry human. Now, one of these humours, black bile, also known as melancholy, this is where we get the word melancholy from, is cold and it's wet. And that's linked to sadness and depression in the early modern period. So if you ate foods that had those same elemental qualities, you ran the risk of producing more melancholy in your body, which would make you sad.
So you got the connection between emotion and food really, really strongly there, haven't you?
Yeah, so it's not just that it kind of affects your relationships with people and how you engage with the world, it's that it actually changes the physical properties of your body, and that those changes can create emotion within the early modern body.
So they had a real connection with the food that they were eating and where it was from and how it was grown. And that's very different nowadays, isn't it? I think nowadays a lot of people have a real disconnect with their food and where it's coming from. I know in the past me and my colleagues have taken some of the collection from our botanical gardens into school. So we've taken trees of coffee plants, tea plants, we've taken sugar cane, licorice plant, people don't realise licorice is from a plant, ginger, things like that, and we've taken them into schools and shown them that the importance of the food that they eat, but also where it comes from. You know, that, and I'm really quite surprised sometimes at some of the reactions of the school kids, and they really get engaged with this activity. And what we do is we bring in, a bag of sugar, and we say, right, which plant do you think this sugar's come from? And they look at the bag of sugar and they never connected that with a plant. Yeah. And we say, well, it's a sugar cane or it's a beet plant. And so making that connection for school kids has been very important for me in the past. As a botanist, I want people to connect with their food and appreciate their food. But did you think really, just bringing it up really to the modern day, about this with the lockdown and everything, I think people recently have really become to appreciate their food, and there's been more of a connection of local farms, local farm shops, growing them. I think people, when food has become scarce or more difficult to get from your supermarket, people have had that emotional connection to their food heightened. Do you think that might be true? Yeah, and I think it's about, like you say, it's about accessibility to these foods. So we're so used in the modern world to being able to go to a supermarket and basically get anything that we want from any part of the globe. And that's just not something that could happen in this period, especially if you've travelled halfway around the globe to settle in one of these new colonies. So I think lockdown has maybe encouraged people to think more about where their food comes from and think more about
the foods that they eat and how that impacts them, how that impacts their emotions, how it impacts their health, all these things.
Their well-being, isn't it? Food and well-being, health and well-being.
And I think really in this period, in the colonial period, part of the emotional power of food is that people are really concerned about where it comes from. And that's because of what we said about how they understand their bodies. So they want to know what kind of climate it's been grown in. They want to know whether it's from England or whether it's from another part of the world. And they want to know those things because it can have an impact on who they are as an individual, who they are as a person.
So it's been really fascinating talking to you, Rachel. It's really brought home to me that as scientists we can learn a lot from historians, and it's been great talking to you and learning about the parallels between 400 years ago, now, and into the future and climate change.
Yeah, definitely. And I think looking at your specimens that you brought along as well, it helps me understand my historical texts a little bit better as well, because I can connect what they're talking about to this scientific process that you've kind of outlined for us. And I also want to say thank you to Annie for inviting us to this wonderful space to have this conversation and to let us access some of the treasures of the John Rylands Research Institute and Library. So thank you, Annie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel and Amanda, for sharing your time in research with us today. And thank you for watching. If you'd like to find out more, check out our Being Human webpage and follow the John Rylands Library on social media. That's all from us today. Bye now.